Hello, I'm Rick Bine in the Geography Department at IUPUI, and today I'm going to take you to New Guinea. This is this island north of Australia. It's divided between two countries. It's an independent country of Papua New Guinea, and the other side belongs to Indonesia, this country that stretches across here. So I took a 3-year leave of absence to go to Papua New Guinea, absence from IUPUI, and I went to work in this little city up at the top here called Lae, and I taught at the University of Technology there in the forestry department. And not only was I teaching there, I was doing a lot of work around the country and a lot of experiences going here and there. And one particular project was with a group called, it was an NGO, a non-government organization, that had a project down the coast. And so here we're looking, and here's a Lae up in that little corner there. Then we went down about 2 hours down the coast there. And you can see this better on another map. It was about 2 hours down the way, and they wanted to set up they're working there as a research site for bring in biologists and do other things and maybe expand some tourism maybe. And so they needed somebody to get things started. And the first thing they wanted to do was to start a trail up the mountain there. And when the trail was from the coastline there, and it went up to 6,000 feet to the top of a mountain there. They called it Blue Mountain. That was the intention, to get it up there. And what was the purpose of the trail? The purpose of the trail was to bring biologists in there to sample this virgin rainforest for different species that were there, previously unidentified. And so they wanted to go have somebody set that up. And I had to work with the villagers, several of them. I met with the whole village at one point with somebody who explained what I was doing there and introduced me, and I told them what we were going to do. I had to spend some time with the village elders to make them comfortable with me there, and found that we were going to have to go into the forest. It was interesting that most of the people were afraid of the forest, and their livelihood was along the coast. And they had the clearing there for the village and all that, and they lived off of fishing, and they had little gardens down up the coast a ways, and they didn't go into the forest. Remember, they were afraid of it. I said, well, why are you afraid? Well, that's where the ancestors live, and they're the spirits, and we want to allow them their privacy and keeping things to the forest. That's their place, and we don't know what they'll do. Maybe they'll cause bad things to happen to us. So I couldn't get many of them excited about going off into the forest. But there were 3 people that did, because they were hunters for the village. And they went off into the forest and hunted game. And they brought meat back to the village to, give them some more to the diet. But normally their diet was fish and vegetables. But now they had some wild animals to eat. But anyway, those 3 hunters were willing to go with me to help build this trail going up the mountainside there. And so we had to cross over a ridge to get there. We hiked out that way. And as we got over the ridge, there was their land, their area along the coast. They had never moved anybody over that ridge before. And nobody lived over there. And I said, well, why do you keep this ridge unoccupied? And he says, well, this is the valley of the ancestors. And they inhabit this area, and so we have to work with them and make sure it's okay that we invade their territory. And it was kind of interesting because we tried to do that, and we started straight toward the mountain initially, and we could see there was a straight cliff there, and there was no way we were going to go up that straight cliff. There you can see that there's a ridge going around the side of it. So I said, this would be easier if we took this thing along the edge, this little ridge going up around and sort of halfway behind the mountain. And it'd be longer, but it'll be easier. And they quickly agreed to that because that was on the edge of the Ancestors Valley. And so they felt a little safer being there rather than marching through the Ancestors' territory. And so we started up the trail, and we camped. And the first night, one of the hunters, his name is Levy, started gyrating in his hammock. That's what we were sleeping in. And I woke him up, and he said, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, the Ancestor was attacking me." And anyway, he couldn't sleep after that, and he went and sat by the fire. And then in the morning, he told me that the Ancestor wanted to know who this white man was, what was he doing, what's his purpose, and what's this sort of, why is he here? And he told him, well, I was okay, and I was helping out and going to help the village. We get some development going. And so I said, well, was the Ancestor happy with that? And he says, well, I think so. And so we continued. The next day we started going up the trail some further, and it was interesting because we were building this trail. And so the way we did it was with machetes, and one guy would lead the group, and take his machete and swing it back and forth as fast as he could, and maybe get through, maybe 20 or 30 yards up the way until he became exhausted, and we got a little trail. And the next guy would pick up the machete and go after it. And so little by little, we began creating this little pathway up the top of along the ridge there. And I thought, hey, I ought to take my turn. So okay, go ahead. And they gave me a machete, and after a couple of swings, they stopped me. They took the machete away and says, "Stop! You're unsafe. You're going to cut yourself, or you're going to cut one of us. Here, we're going to give you your camera back, and you go behind." So okay, I'll do that. So anyway, we continued on up, and we spent a night there, and then actually at this point we had to stop because it was like the day was starting to get short, and so we returned back to the village, and I had to go back to Lay so I could get back to my classes and teach. And so the next weekend I came back out down to the village, and we went back up the trail and went up there, and we were cutting along and went there, and finally the guy at the head who was doing the chopping then with the machete, he suddenly went into a panic, and he came back and to the other two guys, and he was speaking in their Kala language and going really, you could see the terror in his eyes. And I said to Levy knew English pretty well. He'd been in the National Guard for New Guinea and Papua New Guinea, and so I asked him, "What's happening?" He says, "Well, Tani ran into one of these Masalai." That's the word for the Ancestors. And I said, "Well, gosh, what?" And Tani looked at me and says, "We have to stop this project. We can't go any further." I says, "Oh no, we really can't. How do we do this?" And so I started asking questions. I really don't want to abort this project. So I started asking questions and asked him. He says, "Well, what did he look like?" Well, he was wearing animal skins, and he was carrying a tomahawk, and he was looking at me. Did he say anything? No, he didn't say anything. And I said, "Then what did he do?" Well, he turned and went up he turned around in the forest and went right up where we were going to cut the trail. "We have to stop this project. We can't do it anymore." And I sat there for a while, and I said, "Listen, could it be that he's shown us the way?" And they bought it immediately. And so we continued on up the mountain. It's something, because I always thought that they always saw the Ancestors, these Masalai, in a negative way, but now they were trying to help us. And so maybe I introduced a kind of foreign concept that maybe the Ancestors could be helpful rather than negative. But anyway, they were ready to accept that, and we went on up. And in a way, that negativity might have been a way that was important to the culture and keeping the balance with nature and all that sort of thing. Because here we are cutting a trail up there, or this little pathway up the mountain, is disrupting the ecology, and that maybe it could lead to other things that might be eventually destructive. And so the Ancestors seemed to be aware of that, and this invasion that we were creating. But there were a lot of interesting plants. You can see it in the pictures there where there was these carnivorous pitcher plants, and they had a little lid on them, and they catch insects, and then they would digest the insects. And there were a lot of other plants in another picture there with these broad leaves sticking out. These were one of the species they found that was unique to this area. No other parts of New Guinea had this. It's interesting because you have the rainforest is very large, but you have little pockets here and there with species that are only in those little areas. And that's pretty typical rainforests around the world. I experienced the same thing in Brazil. But anyway, this was one of the neat plants that we were seeing there. But one of the destructive things we saw was that we came across an old tree. There was a dead tree standing up out there in the forest. And they wanted to cut this thing down. Well, they did. They started chopping it down. And I said, well, Levy, why are you chopping that down? Well, it's dead. Doesn't matter. I said, wait a minute. That old dead tree is the home for a lot of species that live in there. Owls and rodents and monkeys and whatever else is going to be in there. They would occupy this tree, and it's really important piece of the forest. And well, they'd already cut it down, but anyway, I think I got him attuned to that because he told me later on that he was preserving those trees and teaching the rest of the village that those things were good. But anyway, we continued on up the mountain, and when he got up to about 4,000 feet. We camped, and the vegetation was changing. It was no longer tall rainforest. It was now a shorter rainforest, and we were entering the cloud layer. You will see in that one picture there where there's a cloud, a halo of clouds around that level of the mountain. And as we started into that, it got cold. And as long as we were working and chopping away, we were okay. But when we stopped, we started getting hypothermia, and it was really a challenging period there, and we slept in the hammocks that night, and everybody was shivering. And now, at that morning, they said, we can't go anymore. This is it. It got cold. Would you believe it got down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit? And for me, that was quite pleasant because we've been down at 90 degrees all the time down on the coastline. And that's what they were used to, but now 60 was just unbelievable for them. So we had to abandon that. So we made the trail up to 4,000. We never made it to 6,000. But maybe the rest of that trail, rest of that area may be good to preserve it. You had these little bits of tundra up in there starting out. And so maybe that could leave that for future work there. So after that, we began bringing in biologists. I remember brought in one guy there from Texas. He was there just for the summer to do some research there, and he was a specialist in horseflies, and so we only stayed in the lower parts of it. He had these nets. He was catching horseflies, but he found that it was easier if you had some bait to bring the horseflies around. And so, guess what was the bait? Well, it was me, and I had to walk ahead of him a little bit. And he had his net, and the horseflies would land on my back, and he'd hit him with the net right away and catch him. And then it was okay until one time he got a little slow. And I says, Jim, get that fly now. And he was biting me. But anyway, after that, he had to find some other way to catch his horseflies. But that was one of the biologists. And since then, I've noticed online they've had maybe 30 or 40 other biologists come up and use that trail and do different things. And they've got numbers of papers written and many different species identified after that. And they're in this little village is called Lavabia. And it's also, the locals, it's called Kamiali. But anyway, you can go online and Google those names, and you can see the bookwork, the stuff they've done with the recordings and all that, and the articles that have been written. So this is sort of what's there. But anyway, going back into the village again and meeting with the people, and they were so concerned about the ancestors, and we told them the story of what happened up there, and they were concerned. But anyway, they sort of left it be at this point. So I went on back to the university there, and then shortly after it, I had to go back to the States. And so I came back and taught another year at IUPUI, and then I got a small grant to go back to New Guinea for the summer. And I went back, same place, taught a couple classes there. It's a different season there, so there wasn't really their summer. But anyway, I taught a little bit, and then went back to La Babia, the village there, and I got there, and I was trying to do some research. I was recording the vegetables in their garden. They had this big delta that came out of the mountains there, and water was spread out in a number of fingers as they reached into the sea there, and they had their little garden plots in through there. So I was going through there with a GPS machine, a little gadget you get saying recording where everything was, and this made them nervous. What's this machine there? And they didn't like that particularly, but I sort of was kind of bullied my way and said, well, I'll go ahead and do this and get it done. And anyway, as it turned out, as I left that afternoon, and then that night there was a terrible storm that came up, and the river came down and flooded so much that it washed out all their food and their gardens, and all of it washed into the sea. And the villagers blamed it on the ancestors. So I was the one who caused that. So it was really a shocking sort of thing to realize how that would impact and how they perceived it. But anyway, they still like me, but they just no more of this GPS machine. So I went and abided by that ruling, and so it was interesting to see how these ghosts, and if you want to call them ghosts, but the ancestors were so present in their life, and they didn't do many things without consulting them and sort of make sure they didn't get in trouble. And so I don't know how much they were ever began to realize that maybe the ancestors had a positive way of looking at things rather than a negative sort of thing. But after all, maybe it is a conditioning sort of thing where the ancestors kept them from being too destructive.